So what I'll do is make the video available. Probably Nicole will send it out tomorrow. If you wanted to forward your presentations to me as well, if you did, we could also send those out to people so they have both the presentations, just a PDF. We can create a PDF handout kind of thing. So I want to thank Luke and Deb and Carrie for doing this today. And we thank Tim for being our sole in-person person. So thank you for that. I'm not going to go through all the stuff I typically say. I think in terms of bios, everyone, Deb has been a friend of Gray Ag for a long time. She's done a lot of stuff for Grey Bruce Farmers Week as well as Gray Soil and Crop. Luke has, we had him at Grey Bruce Farmers Week this past year, and so it was great to have him there then. And Carrie's been a great help with Gray Soil and Crop as well. We were doing some crop walk stuff last year. So when we thought about doing an agronomy panel, these three seem to be a perfect threesome to pull all together and get some great advice from. I'm not going to go ahead and read their bios. I think what we'll do is when we send out the link to the video, I'll put the bios in there. So I don't want to waste time doing that. We were going to do a poll, but we'll just ask Tim the questions. Tim, what all do you grow?
For myself, my crop's all in one farm each year. My farm is all in one crop each year. This year it is going to be corn. It was wheat last year, but I'll be growing corn this year, I guess.
And do you have any livestock?
Just a small amount, some hobby farm type stuff. Yeah, a few calves and a few chickens.
Cool. We were going to ask everybody what was keeping them up at night when they think about planning for crop 21. Maybe the facilitators can kind of say what they hear people are worrying about. But Tim, is there anything that's pressing on your mind as to a worry for crop 21?
It's usually my 2-year-old that tends to keep me up at night, but past that, for the crops, I don't think anything in. It seems like we have things off to a pretty good start as far as moisture goes. All the snow got away quickly. I don't have anything looming in the back of my mind specifically. I do think things are actually setting up quite well between the weather and the pricing available. So just looking at some tips to maximize things, I guess.
Cool. Luke, Deb, or Carrie, do you think there's anything that's really, really frightening farmers or getting them concerned about the coming year?
Lots of chatter about crop prices and input prices, specifically fertilizer. I think there's still money to be made where we're sitting at today, but I think producers want to stay on top of that sort of thing and stick with their plan and not get, it gets easy to spend maybe a little bit more in a high crop price season, but, we still want to have money left at the end of the day. So keep the bells and whistles maybe to a minimum.
Cool. Luke or Carrie?
I'd agree with Deb fully. That's been most of the chatter over the last probably 3 months or so since the new year. Most seem excited, especially with this weather that we've gotten here now. Everybody's getting wound up.
And Dad?
Yeah. I agree. We are in like a golden couple of months of agriculture here from a cash crop standpoint. The two stresses that I had talked to farmers over the winter, both really related to soybeans. One was I sold too many soybeans too early at $13. Now they're damn near 16 for 2021. And the other concern is the livestock guys who got to buy the high priced soy meal on the other end. That hurts. And even corn, a lot of guys in the bought in stockers are feeding some pretty expensive feed, which is not fun. But
Great.
It's different concerns than normal. That's for sure.
Okay, so what we're going to do, I thank you for those opening comments. What we're going to do is each of the facilitators is going to do a presentation, and we're going to go in the order of Luke, Carrie, and then Deb, and then they have another short presentation that they'll do in that same order. So we're going to let Luke start us off and take it away, please.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Hopefully, you all see that?
Yes,
Yes.
Perfect.
perfect.
So I'm going to spend a bit of time here on cereal management, talking about winter wheat as well as spring cereals. So we're lucky. This is March 23rd, and we can see every single wheat field in this area of Ontario, and not often we can get a good look at wheat this early. For the most part, it came out of the winter unscathed. We're setting ourselves up for some really good yields. We're going to assume that you did all these things in the fall. You planted at the proper depth, the proper seeding rate. You got a weed-free field, and you got some phosphorus down with that seed. So hopefully you've done that, and you're setting yourself up for success. The next thing that you need to be aware of is become familiar with this growth chart. A lot of applications we do on wheat are very correlated to the staging of the actual plant itself, or the wheat in the field. Definitely not on calendar day, because that can change from year to year. And so this is the Zadok stage scale. It's in publication 811 in the Ontario Agronomy Guide. So become familiar with this. We'll kind of touch on each certain stage as we go along here. So like I said, we have a golden opportunity here right now to get out into our wheat fields and check it, do our early spring checks, which normally don't happen until sometimes into May. And three key things that we need to be looking for is we want to assess the field for any winter or spring damage. We want to do some stand counts. We also want to check if we have winter annual pressure in our fields. And see, these are three main things that I look for myself and suggest growers to look for in their own fields when they're taking a walk in their fields. So talking about winter kill, I guess winter kill can be deceiving. Sometimes we can get a lot of loss from here till April if we have some really very, very wet weather or some extreme events where it goes from very, very warm to very, very cold. Hopefully we don't get that. But things we're looking for is we get into a field, how uniform is that field? A lot of us know our farms very well. Go to your spots that are generally lower or water holds. Usually those are the spots you first see winter kill set in. You want to be looking how well your plants are rooted. It can be very deceiving this time of year because the ground's often wet, certainly wetter than it is at the moment. And a lot of these plants that aren't well rooted, the roots are on the top of the surface. They look green, they look like they're going to survive, and they are not going to survive. And if they do, they're certainly not going to yield to full potential. And any snow mold damage, there is some this year. We generally get it when we get consistent snow cover for most of the winter, and we did this year for the first time in a couple of years. And just a couple notes here: if there's areas of nothing, or you think you got to rip up your field, start thinking about a plan B, or you can put some fertilizer on it to try and perk things up. But you should really be looking at doing stand counts before you make any rash decisions. And so here's a couple tips here. I'm not gonna lie, Tim Mielstein from C&M Seeds on this call, they have some awesome information on their website that goes over stand assessments. So thanks, Tim and the crew at C&M. A lot of this is pulled from the Ontario Agronomy Guide. We want to be looking at in this analysis here on our plants per foot of row. If you're getting consistently 7 plants or less, it's probably a rip up the field situation, or at least a section of the field if you can square it off and save the rest of the field. If you're consistently getting 8 to 12, weigh your options. You still have pretty good yield potential. And if you got 12 plus, by all means, you should be keeping that field. Some notes, once again, those plants must be well rooted. You kind of want a pretty uniform counts. Like if you're getting several with 3 and then several with 20, you kind of got to assess it, and hopefully you can square it off a section that is not good. And when you're doing these counts, like bare minimum 10 stand counts per field I would suggest doing more than that if you have the time, especially if the field is larger. The more you do, the better you're going to get. Or you can divide the field up into zones and do 10 samples per zone if you know the field is relatively uniform in those sections. This is my handy little stand assessment device. It is made up with some PCV pipe and some elbow joints. I made it myself, believe it or not. Anyways, this really helps me gauge a foot. So I do 2 counts within that square foot, both representing a foot of row. And I take that information. And when I'm doing this, I want to look at the plants. So we talk about plants per foot of row, but not every plant has the same yield potential. Stuff planted pretty early, and in general, Grey Bruce, September 20th to 30th in that ballpark. That's generally, or even earlier in some areas, especially at the Grey Highlands. That's generally our optimum yield planting dates for wheat. And that wheat this year is looking a lot like our advanced wheat. We got 2 or more tillers. I was in the field yesterday. We were getting like 4 or 5 tillers. That's a little excessive. So ideally, we want 2 tillers, 3 tillers on that plant plus main stem. So we're going to count those because that's going to help us assess how many stems we're going to get per foot of row. And then on the other side, we have the less advanced wheats. This wheat that was probably planted a little bit later. This year, wheat that's looking like that, from what I've seen, is generally planted around Thanksgiving or a little bit later. We had some wheat planted well into October, and that week we had in November really allowed that wheat to get up and out of the ground. Not often we'll get a 20-degree week in November, but we were very lucky to do so last fall. And so once you have your information as far as stems per foot of row, so we've counted our plants and we've counted how many stems are on that plant. And I like to use this guide here. Once again, it's from C&M Seeds as a resource to tell me how close we are to optimal stems per, in this case, square yard. We like to use a lot of funny measurements in Ontario agriculture. So this is in square yards. So you get to this number by the top row there, getting your average number of plants per foot of row, and on the side sidebar, you have your average number of stems. So that includes your main head plus your tillers. So generally, you want to have about 450 to 600 heads per square yard. Why is this important? Well, it kind of sets yourself up to think about into the future as far as a fertility program. Is this a field that I can push? I should be achieving top end yield. And if you don't have the plants stand to do that, it's going to be a little more challenging. If we're landing in that 450 to 600 and we're on a good field, good farm with good fertility, by all means, we should be starting to think about a bit more aggressive strategy. And the third thing that I really like to do is check for winter annuals. Here's 6 fairly common winter annuals I find in fields around here. We've got some dandelion, chickweed, fleabane, field violet, and bluegrass, and wild carrot. From the fields that I've seen thus far, we've got some pretty clean fields. We set up set ourselves up pretty good last fall with some burn downs ahead of the wheat. Or even some in-crop applications. And that is, from what I've seen, becoming more prevalent in our area, which is great. I have yet to see any fields with a lot of winter annuals in, but when you're out for your spring walk, certainly make note of this because it'll make your herbicide selection a lot more relevant once you get to that stage of needing to do so. So once I said, we get to this, get this information gathered, and then we want to look at our fertility strategy. So knowing what we have in our fields, I have an advanced and an unadvanced program. The advanced program, I suggest going on there with about 75 to 100 pounds of N with some sulfur. You want that on by growth stage 31. My opinion, there's no rush and the soil is fit. This year, I've gotten a lot of phone calls in regards to should I be putting stuff on my wheat. Yet my general stance is if you want to do anything, you can go out there with some ammonium sulfate, 100 pounds, 125 pounds, Give it a little plant food to wake up. I really think it's too early for this 75 to 90 units of N at this stage. On the other side, we're dealing with plants that have one tiller or less. I do think we need to get on those fields early. I wouldn't be opposed to putting 40, 50 units on those fields now to try to get them either up and out of the ground or encourage some tillering. Once again, it is early. So know your fields. Is it a field that is soaking wet and you really shouldn't be on there already? Then yeah, don't do that field. Save it for later. I might ask Carrie and Deb, do you have any takes on this right now? I know you're looking at wheat fields right now too. Any input?
Sure. Yeah, right now, the fields that I'm walking, I've been walking quite a bit of the later planted wheat. Not seeing a heavy amount of tillers at the moment, but our early planted stuff, like after canola, it's just incredible how much it's tillered out. Yeah, minimum 2, probably 3 tillers at the moment.
Yeah, we have a mix of mostly the picture on the left with 2 or 3 tillers. We do have some very advanced fields that have more like 4 and 5 tillers. Planted. We had some early bean harvest there last September, obviously, and turned them around very quickly. To me, my cutoff is, 3 tillers is great. 2 and 3 tillers is just about, that's kind of the sweet spot. We start seeing 4 and 5 tillers, that's almost too much. And to have a few of those tillers sort of disappear, have a little bit of stress on them and have them not be productive is not a bad plan out of the gate. And to me, that just means hold off on some of that early nitrogen and yeah, just like what you've got there, and on some of that late seeded stuff that's 0 or 1 tillers, feed her well and feed her early. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I liken the 4 or 5 tiller plants to like a corn plant with like 3, 4 ears. It looks cool, but you really don't want that.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, I agree. And there's a few fields out there, which I usually see more fields that aren't out of the ground than those most years. So no, that's good. So moving on with the fertility program, I'm a strong believer in split applied nitrogen, and there's going to be in some fields that I deal with this year, there'll be 3 applications, especially in the hard red. So in a soft red winter wheat scenario, I like to normally see the balance of the fertilizer on by grow stage 40. Generally speaking, most guys are doing a minimum of 120 units of N. On those fields, you've got your stem counts at like 450 to 600. And we do have a good field. By all means, you should be pushing your wheat a bit harder. There's enough data out there and on-farm trials that this seems to pay. And unless you haven't paid attention to the markets for the last, wheat's been pretty good for a little while now, bro. I guess I'm trying to say the extra fertility is going to pay if we can get the yield response on those good fields. So going back, do your stand counts and know where you're heading into the season. On the hard red side of things, we need a bit more aggressive strategy. We're trying to push for yield, but as well as protein, because growers get paid a premium and deducted if they don't certainly hit protein marks. Same deal. You need to be a minimum, in my opinion, 100 or 150 units and 20 to 25 pounds of sulfur. But growers who are achieving 3 ton plus protein are generally a lot closer to that 200 pounds and 20 or 30 units of sulfur. And a lot of those guys are doing 3-pass program with a third one, usually with a metis, either pre or post anthesis. I talk about fertility too. I'm not trying to just only say you need nitrogen and sulfur to grow a crop. You certainly need your other nutrients there as well. Your phosphorus and your potassium levels in your field to be adequate, as well as any other secondary micros that you may have maybe a need on your farm based off soil test results. So that's the main notes I had on winter wheat. if there's any questions from our audience, you can let us know, Tim. Otherwise, I'm going to switch gears into spring cereals. All right, I'm going to switch gears into spring cereals. So tips for success. These are points that have been mentioned at any other session that people listen to on spring cereals. But I'm just going to kind of belabor the point. The 5 I have out on here is we want to plant it early. We want to plant it at proper seeding rates. We need a 21st century fertility program. We want to keep it clean and keep it standing. So plant early. Why? Because we often get a longer growing season, which improves a bit more tailoring. Whoop, getting ahead of myself here. It helps us avoid that heading and grain fill period and right in the middle of our hot summer, which can also in turn be the driest part of the year, often, not always, but often. Frost seeding. There's been some good opportunities a couple days ago to get some frost seeding action occurring. And even right now, I know there's some growers planting cereals into actually fit soil conditions, which is awesome for the month of March. But we still might have opportunity to do some frost seeding here yet. So watch those nighttime temperatures heading into the late March and into April as it looks like we're heading back down to more seasonal temperatures. And yeah, one note I tell guys, if you're going to start a field at frost seeding, if you have only a certain amount of hours, make sure you pick the field that you can finish or square it up nicely so you don't have a wonky field that half got planted in March and half got planted on May 1st. So here's the data. This is once again out of Ontario publication 811, research done by Peter Johnson. And it clearly shows a yield increase as well as a increase in bushel weight by early seeding. Their studies just looked at oats and spring wheat. Oats on their 2-year trial at various different seeding rates, they got a almost 20 bushel year response and a bushel or 1.5 pounds per bushel, which on oats, that's huge because a lot of these contracts are based off of test weight. And in spring wheat, on average, they got 15, almost 16 bushels and even more test weight. And like that to me is the no-brainer. Try and get this stuff planted as early as possible. And if that means frost seeding, watch for your opportunity to do so. The other big point growers need to know and do, we need to plant by seed count. It's the industry is kind of funny because winter wheat, we're very good at talking about, at least in my opinion, we're very good at talking about planting by seeds per acre. For some reasons, spring cereals are less into that. I get a lot of guys, should I be doing 2 bags an acre? I know there's some people talk by the bushels. Like, no, don't do that. We got to be looking at seeds per acre, which is based off of a hope for final plants per acre. So these are the recommended seeding rates for oats, barley, mixed grain, and spring wheat in Ontario. And this is just to show you how you can be out several thousand seeds per acre by just planting the exact same seed rate. So these are actually from Snowland Farms. This is their seed counts this year for 3 different barleys that they handle. As you can see, DS 812 is quite a bit smaller seed than Bornholm. So if you go to the field and have the same setting for DS 812 and the same setting for Bornholm, you're going to be planting a difference of 200,000 seeds. That is huge. You need to be adjusting and knowing what your actual seed count is before you head to the field. I did the math. It's 15%. That is quite a large margin. And then we also need to fertilize properly. I've certainly heard the saying, we use triple 19 for years. It's done a good job. We're going to keep using triple 19. That's great, but it's not a 21st century fertility program. Tips for successful strategy, much like winter wheat, we want to try and have some starter down. If you can only do phosphorus, that's fine. You can mix with the seed if you're okay with that going through your drill. Use something like MAP or MES. Those are both great sources of doing that. We have to talk about a nitrogen strategy. I usually like to see, once again, a 2-pass program, and we'll get to that later, but we want to see at least 40, 60 pounds up front of nitrogen and some sulfur as well. And I do like to see a secondary pass, ideally after first node has set in, growth stage 31, 32. And at that stage, you can kind of see a yield potential for your crop. You can do your stand counts. You can look at the crop a lot better and gauge on what application at. Here's just some suggested rates for barley, oats, and spring wheat. And then you get the feedback is, but if I apply all this fertilizer, my crop is going to go flat. Well, we don't want that to happen. We farm ourselves, and flat wheat, barley is just a headache. Nobody likes that. So we have to keep it standing. And it's for sure a concern. How you're going to do this is we're going to try and split apply our nitrogen. That in itself will help keep that crop upright. I am not a big fan of manure ahead of spring cereals. Manure is great to have on the farm. You can easily overdo it on manure or underdo it as well. I'd rather see manure go on corn, or if you have way too much, I would suggest trying to stockpile it and apply it after that cereal crop is off if possible. Certainly, I would suggest growers to strongly look at growth regulators. The two I would steer people towards is Modus, which is a new product from Syngenta, and Manipulator. I personally have used Manipulator on spring cereals, and I've been quite happy with the results we've seen by using it. We often tank mix it with a fungicide, and we've seen very good crop safety. Deb, Carrie, have you two had experience with growth regulators on spring cereals?
Yep. We certainly use it where we think there's some benefit. And last year we certainly were targeting oats. It's nice to be able to have that option on oats, particularly with Manipulator. I don't know that Modus is registered quite yet on spring cereals, but or on oats specifically, I should say.
it is. I looked into it last week, I think it was.
Okay, awesome.
One thing I should say though is growers still should check with their buyer, because I don't know if all the buyers have signed off on it.
Yeah. To me, it was, I found there was quite a difference between a 1-pass of, in this case last year, it was Manipulator versus 2 passes. There was a very noticeable benefit to a 2-pass under the environmental conditions we had last year. So of course that's going to change year to year, but I was pretty impressed with 2 passes of half rate versus 1 pass of full rate. So, there's a bit of play in the growth regulators and how we use them, and a little bit difficult to figure out just the exact way to do it on any given year, but definitely some pluses.
Yeah, interesting. I've never done the half rate double app. When were you going staging wise?
So we were going at first node, and then we were going at flag leaf again.
Okay.
Yep. Which for oats, that'd be for a scenario where you're putting 100 plus units of nitrogen on oats, targeting that big, 150, 180 bushel oat crop. So definitely need some assistance to keep it standing at that point.
Yes, you would.
Yeah.
Good. And then moving on, this can be also applied to winter wheat. We want to keep our cereals disease and weed free. I find and this is changing, this is getting better, but there's often more reluctance to put a fungicide on spring cereals, but there is huge benefit, not only from yield, but from a test weight standpoint, that if you're going to grow this, especially if you're selling it, you have to be doing this in order to achieve your test weight and yield targets. Keeping the field weed free everyone can understand that, and most growers do a good job of identifying what products to use in their field. Cereals, not only wheat but also spring cereals, often give a good opportunity to use a couple different modes of action that you may not use in strictly a corn soy rotation. So also a good opportunity to try to maybe knock back some more persistent or different weed spectrums or any glyphosate resistant weeds that you may have in your farm. And so this is kind of a structured guide, I guess, on how you would apply these on both spring and winter cereals. A lot of growers know this. If you work with an agronomist, they will be able to go over with this with you. The only thing I would change is on that heading pass on oats. You generally want to be a bit earlier on that flag leaf. And combining, set your combine right. It's we can lose a lot of crop in anything we combine if we don't have things set up. There's a lot of really good combine loss identifiers, like helping you identify if it's header loss or if it's going through the combine. On the web, Michigan State, I find, has some really good information, so look that up. In my opinion on straw, in this area, we generally have some pretty good organic matter levels. If you got a good market for it, I would suggest selling it, to be honest with you. I wouldn't give it away, but certainly sell it. That's all I had in spring cereals. So I did have some stuff on alfalfa and manure, but I don't know if you want, Lori, if you want me to talk on it now, or if you want to move on to Carrie and Deb. Either way works.
I think we might as well just continue with this portion for you, and then we'll go to Carrie and then Deb, if that's okay with everybody else.
Yep.
Alrighty. So some quick tips on alfalfa. I've been in a few fields, and actually I'm seeing a lot more frost heaving than I really thought we would be seeing, mostly correlating to guys cutting late. So like winter wheat, we want to be out in the field doing some stand assessments. It's a great way to see how our alfalfa is going into the season. It gives a guy or gal a good understanding of whether they need to be keeping their stand, or if maybe should be taking a first cut and looking at an option for plan B after that cut. Here's some basically stem counts. I would use that same square that I use for winter wheat to do these, and looking at the different ranges, what we want for a ideal stands in our alfalfa. Note the stand count gets lower as the plants as the stand ages. Often the older the plants get, the more shoots they send out, so that you do need a few less plants per square foot to really achieve your top end yields. But when you're out there looking at your alfalfa this spring, you got to have a keen eye, because you do not want to be counting these unhealthy plants towards those stand count numbers. You should be cutting open some alfalfa plants and looking for root rot diseases, in this case Phytophthora, and then you want to be looking for if there's a lot of frost heaving going on. The one plant here, it's up out of the ground, looks to be an inch or two, and it's not likely going to produce a whole lot after a first cut. And if anything, depending how well it's popped out, or badly it's popped out, I should say, it might even get chopped off in that first cut. And that's really not coming back after that. So just be aware of that. Fertility. You should be having a fertility strategy on your alfalfa stands. It should be hopefully pre-planned, discussed in the winter. It should be based off soil samples. My opinion is from an agronomic standpoint, I prefer more or less a spoon feeding approach. I don't like blasting all the fertility on at once, especially potassium. I work with a number of dairy farmers, and they're always watching like a hawk their potassium levels in their feed sample, which can cause issues in the barn, which we want to avoid. I really like suggesting guys to go out there with an early spring approach, as soon as you can get on there in the field without making a mess, doing a mixture of ammonium sulfate, potassium, or potash, and boron. And then after each cut, I'm generally recommending growers to go out there with some potassium and sulfur. I should have put phosphorus in there too. A lot of growers in gray brews have manure. I find liquid manure works great. Don't do it though if the field's too wet, or if you've waited too long and the field has started to grow. You're better off to then look at buying in fertilizer or do nothing. Like, don't go out there if you got 2 or 3 inches of regrowth. That compaction really hurts those that alfalfa coming back, especially if it's a wet year. And one just big caveat at the bottom. Remember, forages are great for rotation, but if your fertility on your stands is not kept up, you can really reduce your soil test levels in that field. And I've often in a scenario where a grower's taking a hay field out after 3, 4, sometimes 5 years, and even if they've been doing a decent job of putting nutrients back on, those fields are often quite a bit lower. Like alfalfa and grassy hay takes a lot out of the ground, so just something to be aware of. We have to be monitoring for alfalfa leafhopper, potato leafhopper in alfalfa. And the past couple of years, I really think this has been an under-scouted pest. We have come off of 2 seasons where we had very dry, hot July and August. Even 2019 was pretty hot and dry in those 2 months. And a lot of growers just chalked up their field for not doing well, just to drought. Oh, it's drought. It's just too dry. It's not coming back. But when you actually get into those fields and you start doing sweeps, from my scenario, there was a lot of potato leafhopper that should have been controlled earlier because it was really hindering yield. So growers should be looking to try and scout. Here is some parameters on how to scout for them. The levels of potato leafhopper thresholds really varies based on how high that alfalfa is. And to scout properly, you do need a sweep net. There's some great YouTube videos on how to scout for potato leafhopper, so I'd suggest looking those up. And lastly, disease management. I've been playing around with a few growers with fungicide on their alfalfa. Specifically, we're going after common leaf spot. It's those brown lesions you see on alfalfa leaf often starts from the base of the plant, works itself up and causes the plant to drop its leaves, which is a very palatable part of that actual alfalfa plant. And growers want to maintain that leaf on that plant to more or less maintain feed quality. Often a worse situation in wet, cool seasons. And the fungicide to do that with is Preaxer. This is often applied first thing in the spring. So once you have, I believe the spray time it's based off height. I think it's 6-7 inches. You can do it up to 2 times a year. Often I've done it with guys first thing, then after second cut, heading into third cut. And lastly, manure. And we're not going to spend I'll try to go through this as quick as possible, but a lot of you guys know this. This is quick reminders. Don't spread too wet. You're going to see your racing streaks through the whole season. That corn that looks sick yellow is not going to yield very well compared to any areas that's not compacted. So don't be out there, especially now. Guys are like, oh, the field's dry. Get out there, do some digging. It's not all dry because a lot of the snow in some situations just left 2 days ago. Those areas are not dry. So do a good scout before you start going in the field. Spread that manure evenly. You're going to get a lot better consistency throughout the field if you can do a good job of making sure it's evenly spread. We've got a lot more or vertical beater spreaders, which do a really good job of having a nice even spread pattern. There's even a number of guys that are renting the spreaders out. So if you have an old horizontal beater, not saying it's doing a bad job, but if you know you want a bit better spread, consider looking at a vertical beater or running one out. There's a few options depending where you live. If you can incorporate it or work it in as soon as you can, you're going to achieve your maximum nitrogen value out of that. You're just eliminating any losses due to that nitrogen gassing off. If you're looking for a job right now and your field's too wet, move your manure, if it's dry, to the field you're going to be spreading. That is going to save you a lot of time when it is go time. In a lot of fields, it's not go time right now and sun's shining. You can do something like this. Unfortunately, there's only one person on the call, so Tim, spread the word, please. And lastly is, look at your fields that you can get your best benefit from that manure. If you don't have enough manure to go in every field, or if you have fields that have seen manure year over year over year and your levels are way too high, I'm going to say you probably don't want to put any more on there and maximize your manure on other fields. And one thing in addition to this is I suggest testing your manure every year, especially liquid manure. In guys with open pit manure tanks, I think you're going to see a bit higher nutrient levels on a year like this. We've had a lot less precipitation starting last fall, over the winter, and so far this spring. You might not have as much in the tank, but your nutrient value per 1,000 gallons is going to be likely higher than normal. And so don't be concerned. Maybe you can't get 6,000 gallons across all your corn. Maybe you only need to get 4,000 gallons and you'll have the same nutrients you usually do. You won't know this if you're not testing your manure every year. So I suggest doing that. And that's the end of my spiel.
Thanks so much, Luke. That was great. And I'm sure that we may have some of the people that are only watching the video. We'll encourage them to email me and I will forward any questions to you or Carrie or Deb to answer specifically. So we're going to turn it over to Carrie. So I invite her to share her screen and she can do her presentation.
Okay, here we go. I'm just trying to share the screen here. Let me know if you can see it. There we go. Okay, so it says Zoom will not be able to record the contents of your screen until it is quit.
Until it's what?
Quit. So I may have to, let's see, 1 second.
That's a new one. I've never heard that before.
Yeah, me either. Okay. Is that working there?
There you go. Perfect.
There we go.
That's working? Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Okay. All right, does that work?
Looks great. Thanks, Carrie.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm pretty new to Zoom presentation, even though I've sat in on a lot of Zoom calls over this pandemic. Yeah, so I'm Carrie Davenport. I'm located just outside of Owen Sound and I'm a pioneer rep in the greater Owen Sound area. We cover Grey and Bruce regions with our warehouse located just near Shallow Lake, Ontario. I work with Keith and Scott Kirk as well as Brandon Gillies, and he is located near Bognor, Ontario. Okay, so I just wanted to start it off by saying we should always have a plan. Even if our initial plan gets nixed, it is more efficient. You're going to have more focus and better success if you have a plan. You can see on the screen here that I've kind of given a general overview of a crop plan, and I would highly suggest every producer to have this, as well as give it to their ag retailer, specifically focused on the fertility plans to the right of the screen there. Yeah, so going farm by farm and realistically making an accurate approach and having a yield goal allows for us to make a solid plan and more of a focus on what our outcome should be. Over the last, say, 30 years, P&K fertility applications have remained fairly flat. I'm calling fertility a low-hanging fruit because it's something that we can focus on, and there's very achievable ways of bringing up our fertilizer levels and feeding a crop what it needs. So the question really has been raised over, the last 30 years, whether our P and K deficient soils are limiting further gains in yields. Phos, for example, it's a significant nutrient for crop growth, as many of us know. It's a macronutrient and it's vital to photosynthesis, respiration, and energy storage. As you can see in the picture here, phos uptake is steady throughout the season. Knowing what your phos level is in each individual field is critical to help maximize yields and understand what our removal rates are and what needs to be replaced. Once phos is incorporated into the soil, it's relatively immobile. So tillage, strip till, or placing in the band is the best route for us to go in removing any runoff risk. As for potassium, it's essential for the physiological process, especially enzyme activation, and that's the core of plant growth and development. Potassium uptake in corn is very rapid during the later stages of vegetation that you can see there in the bottom corner, and also in our early reproductive stages as it kind of levels off there at the end during grain fill. The need for sufficient soil test levels for potassium is critical to support that rapid growth and development during the pollination stage, as well as the kernel set there. Both P and K need to be a core focus when we're planning for our corn crop, and it will set us up for stronger yields. You can find removal rates in Pub 811, but just to give you an idea offhand, say 170 bushel crop of corn, it's removing about 60 pounds of phos and 45 pounds of potassium, but that's just from grain. So if you're taking off for silage, it's significantly more. We need to be replacing those nutrients. You can see here, this is our PKP sets for the last year. So that's all of our pioneer plots. And basically, I just wanted to highlight, there's a definite correlation between soil test levels and yields. You can see your soil potassium levels strongly incline, or as it inclines, so does your yields. So I just wanted to make that note and have it highlighted. Nitrogen is another beast that we really have to focus on when we're planning a corn crop. I'm a big supporter in splitting our N applications, about 1 to 1.1 pounds of N per bushel, with the second app carrying the heavier load around that 7 leaf mark. Whether it's Y drop, or if you aren't on the rocks of North Gray, then it's side dressing, and being able to adjust for weather conditions and really how that crop is setting up. I think that gives us a huge advantage to be able to come in later in season. The other low-hanging fruit that I wanted to note is sulfur. I use a 10-to-1 ratio with nitrogen to sulfur. So every 10 pounds of nitrogen, I want a pound of sulfur to go in with that crop. Knocking these off as a core item to have planned is vital for setting up a good corn crop. Okay, most of you probably have done your seed selection, but I think it's something to note still. We started planting, I guess, end of April last year. So we're coming to that 1 month mark out from last year's planting date. But I just want to highlight a few things that should be used while making your decision. And and can change too if our season shortens up here and we end up starting to plant at the end of May. But maturity is important. Capitalizing on your what potentially is your longest maturity seed would be ideal for our area. We have customers growing 84-day to 94-day, and then silage obviously a bit more, but they're all taking the approach, especially after the long season that we had last year. They want to go a longer maturity, and I hesitate a little bit on doing that just for risk management, with a possibility of an early frost. We all have short-term memory. I think it was 2019, we had a very early frost and struggled to get a dry crop off, but 2020 just turned everybody's attitudes around completely. But capitalizing on that longer maturity, we're going to gain definitely, but having a risk management approach is needed. So going farm by farm, like I had in that earlier slide, having a crop plan, knowing what soil type, what potential that field actually has, is important to making the seed decision. Disease package is significant as well. We're starting to see different influences now too with tar spot, and there's always presence of northern corn leaf blight, but having a strong disease package, which I think most hybrids have across the board, is important, as well as drought tolerance, especially in our area. It seems like we can't catch a drop of rain when we start silking, except for last year. We got dumped on for about a month and a half there. So, but keeping that in mind, typically we are a fairly drought prone area. Your trait package is important as well. And yeah, planting, if you have corn on corn ground, then you're wanting a triple stack, remove that risk there. And yeah, making a plan for your seeding rate as well. That can change, especially in spring, like what we had last year. And here, there we go. So yeah, I just wanted to note this. I've used this in a presentation before, but I think it's important to remember. We're at the end of March here, but we're getting 18-degree weather, and it gets people excited, but hold your horses a bit here. So April 21st last year, we got a bit of snow. April 27th, I was putting in a corn plot, and dust was absolutely flying. And then May 4th, we continued on. Temperatures were fluctuating, I would say, during that time as well. But by May 9th, we ended up with quite a bit of snow again. I don't know what percentage of Ontario would have started, but this was pretty early for Grey and Bruce. It's something for us all to learn and remember. We need to be very cautious when that cold snap happens. Plant minimum 2 inches. And if you have dry fit soils like we did there, go, assuming there isn't precipitation coming that's a cold, yeah, like 0 to 5 degrees Celsius hit there. And if there's a frost in the morning, wait until at least noon, so that soil temperature can warm up again. You'll see to the right of the screen, there's some corn plants there that I dug up when doing population counts. Imbibitional chilling, it corkscrews, the seed takes on that water and it gets a cold snap and it's reactive to it. So watch out for that again this year. Who knows what we'll get, but it's something to remember. We compensated by bumping up the populations by minimum 5%, and it it worked out. I mean, we definitely had stand loss, but reacting and following your plan up until the point where you have to change your plan, that's definitely an approach. Just to touch quickly on what needs to happen in your plan, you gotta be out there crop scouting or having a supporter like Deb or Luke involved in your operation, because there's a lot that can happen after the seed's planted. So just as an example, there's tons of these available. Corn scouting calendars, have little booklets too, that I give out to guys if they're wanting to do more scouting on their own. And there's timings there for you to focus on the crop and what you can find during that calendar of the year. Something that needs to be on our radar is western corn rootworm and northern corn rootworm. Especially for those that have a heavy rotation of corn or in close proximity to fields that have as well. We're seeing resistance in Ontario. The other one that probably gets talked about maybe too much, but it's still something that needs to have a focus, is western bean cutworm. You can see there's larvae hatched from those eggs. And we need 5% accumulation in the field to meet economic threshold there. Typically, once tasseling starts, you got to be out there. It's tough. They're hard to find because they can be pretty high up and in sneaky places on the plant. But going to 10 different spots in a field and checking 10 different plants is an easy way for you to manage this. The other thing is most of us in the area have western bean cutworm traps that you can see there as well. They're a pheromone trap. We're monitoring peak flights, and there's different coalitions, I guess, that you can follow to know when the peak flight is happening in your area. And that'll help time when you should get out and scout and check for those egg masses and larvae. The last item for scouting, I would say, is tar spot. It's fairly new to North America. It moved in from Indiana up through Michigan, as you can see there on the map. And there's been findings in Ontario now. It's carried in with wind, but I wouldn't be surprised that we find some in Bruce and Grey County next year. It seems to be a very rapid movement for disease. The timing that you'll actually see the tar spot, those black lesions on top of the leaves there, is around that R3 to R6 stage. And you can keep an eye out earlier, but it's pretty tough. By the time you see it, it sounds like it's pretty far gone. Other management strategies that we're hearing from that mid US states is residue management. Anything that's left on the soil surface will affect the disease severity for the next year, and rotation needs to be considered, as well as hybrid susceptibility. Fungicides are probably going to be used largely surrounding this, but it really needs to be on our radar, and we need to keep tabs on it. The last item that I wanted to talk about was fungicide on corn. We don't see a pile of it, at least in my geography. I don't know about you, Luke, if you see much fungicide, if you guys do much at all on corn.
We see a bit, but like we do a bit. Most consistent payback and where we do it the most is on silage corn, because not only do we, wherever I've weighed it off, we're getting about a half a ton, if not a full ton more of silage. But certainly disease like vomitoxin is always lower. So we do
Yeah.
grain corn. I imagine our acres will be up again this year if corn gets in good shape, and like prices are really often dictate this.
Yeah.
Unless we
Yeah.
start seeing tar spot all the time, then we'll probably do it a lot more often.
It's a bit stressful. Yeah, so I would agree. That's kind of the direction that it's been up here in northern Gray and North Bruce. We're doing some fungicide, I guess, on like triazoles on any silage corn, if the customer's interested in that. But for the most part, I would say people have shied away from it. I don't know if that's because there's not a pile of options for applicators in the area. But where I was down near London, we sprayed grain corn, a pile of grain corn. Now, I don't know, there's 3 components to it. Like I have here, a lot of us have seen the disease triangle, but it really should be noted. It has to have those 3 items to warrant doing it. The other piece that I wanted to just touch on here quick was precipitation really matters. I mean, you can see on this graph here, and rotation matters too. Anything after wheat, not really finding a success rate or as much of an increase in yield, but after following corn, definitely seeing a gain there in yield. But precipitation really matters. This is from last year, and it was across 16 sites, and they measured precipitation as well as yield and rotation. That the more rain you get, obviously, the more susceptibility to that disease pressure we're getting. So we're going to see a benefit to fungicide. And those were the core items that I wanted to touch on for success in corn for 2021. And yeah, if there's anyone else that wants to make a note, feel free, say what you think, but that's what I had there for now.
Doesn't sound like there's any comments from anyone. A great presentation. Do you have some more stuff, Carrie?
Yeah, I do. I didn't know if you wanted to come back to it or if you wanted me to keep going. I can keep going.
Let's do it like what we did with Luke. Just keep trucking, and then when you're finished, we'll go to Deb.
Sure. Okay, so here you go. Yeah, so I just wanted to touch briefly on on-farm trials, and I'm finding a lot more people are interested in doing it and having some fun with it, actually. Yeah, so just a few items of how to create the trial if you're thinking of it. If you have a question that you want answered, an on-farm trial is an excellent way to have it answered. For most of us, or at least for me, I do a lot of hybrid trials or variety trials, side-by-sides, plots, and having more people interested in doing that as well. So making a protocol, a field selection, so a very consistent field that you want to choose, that would be ideal, so that there's not any variations in the areas that you're choosing to do a side-by-side or even a fertilizer trial. And then replicating it is important to take away any possible variances or and consistent management is ideal as well, obviously. Take as many notes as you can. You might find that the question that you had initially will get answered, but it might bring up another question, or you have another finding out of it. and don't be shy with using technology. In this picture, we're using John Deere Ops Center and entering in our hybrids and splitting the planter up and using that. And then also, this was another hybrid trial that I had, and we decided to fly over top, and actually it ended up being a stress emergence issue with a certain hybrid versus the other. And this was a great way to get a full picture of what was happening. By the time we were in full tassel, you really couldn't tell the difference. We flew over top again, but it just gave us an idea of how long that crop was really delayed compared to the other. Very, very close maturity between those two, and supposed tassel timing, but it ended up being a stress emergence issue. And then analyzing the data, breaking down what you're really looking for, and then weighing it off is ideal. And then we also have satellite imagery that we overlaid with our JD Ops and granular, ended up merging together there, and we could see the differences too in our trials there. But it's not difficult to find someone with a weigh wagon or getting a set of scales. There are people around, and especially us, we're flying around all the time. But there's ag retailers that have their own weigh wagons as well that you can reach out and ask to come weigh something off. It's not difficult that way. Just a few ideas for trials is a 3K plot. We did this quite a bit last year, just with the weather that we were getting. We said, okay, let's do mini plots. Say your target pop is 32,000. Do a 35,000 strip, 32,000 strip, and then a 29,000 strip. And it'll give you a good idea of where that target population should be for that hybrid. Another item that we're doing is foliar fertilizer, doing strips of potassium, foliar K, in season, and then other options are fungicide and hybrid and variety side by sides. That's just a few ideas. I wanted to have this noted too. There's an agronomy research summary that Pioneer provides us with, and we can share around. It's a great tool to see what direction things are going in, or even getting ideas for your own trials too. So I can provide that to those that want it. I can email that out. But that's all I had there.
Thanks, Carrie. That was great. Any questions for Carrie's presentation? Hearing none, I will get Carrie to stop her screen sharing, and I will invite Deb to do her presentation.
Okay, there we go. So, good afternoon, Deb Campbell here, and pleasure to be on the panel here today with these other agronomists, and thanks for having me, Lori. So we're looking at our spring planning here for 2021, and probably a lot of those plans are put to bed and wrapped up here at this point in time, or at the very tail end of that planning stage, but maybe there's a little bit of room left to do some tweaking with some ideas that you're hopefully picking up from today. So before I get into things a little too far, I had a special request come in yesterday to wish somebody a happy birthday. And I think this person's going to view this on the recording afterwards. So hopefully they pick up on this. And I just want to wish Ken Mitchell a happy 65th birthday. And that's kind of a big event. And happy birthday to you there. And you can thank your lovely wife for this shout out. So so just to get into things, you know, I own and operate Agronomy Advantage. We're based in Dundalk, and we cover an area that's from basically Highway 8 over to Highway 12, and then from basically Wyerton down to the 401, and conveniently located right in about the middle of that zone, and keeps us hopping every year to crisscross that geography on a regular basis. And there's myself and 2 other agronomists, and we have 3 seasonal staff that come on with us as well. So I'm going to focus a little bit on soybeans and touching on seeding rates and seeding early, which I think we've maybe hammered that one a little bit to death this winter, but it's so important. We'll look at fertility for soybeans and sort of some thought process towards fungicides in soybeans. And then if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about some precision cropping ideas. So of course, we want to be going for high yielding soybeans, and certainly in Ontario, we're seeing yields on a fairly steady incline year over year, but there's a lot of variability year over year. So, you know, we get one season like 2020 where we had some phenomenal soybean yields. If they weren't a record on most farms, they were certainly top 3. And then you take a year like 2019 where, you know, the average was, I believe, about 10 bushels less in 2019 than it was in 2020 as a provincial average, or somewhere very close to that. So how do we achieve these high yielding soybeans consistently? To me is the part that we're looking for, is getting that consistency. So soybeans historically have been very poor from a stress tolerance standpoint. They're very environmentally driven, the yield outcomes, particularly, you know, we talk about moisture in August makes this crop, and it very much does. We know that. But to me, it's as much about setting the crop up to be its you know, potential best coming into August, whether you're at the top end of the yield spectrum or average or perhaps below average. So keeping these stresses out of the soybean crop is, you know, preventing these stresses is certainly one of your strategies that you want to have in mind. And of course, most of these strategies are environmental. You know, compaction we can control to some degree, and but drought and flood and frost and wind, those are all environmentally driven, and we don't have a lot of control over that. However, you know, variety selection, whether we're doing tillage or no-till, all play into available moisture, how plants respond to temperature, things like that, you know, we can't lose sight of what we can actually manage to facilitate minimal stress. So, you know, soybeans basically respond physiologically to any one of those stresses. They have the ability to adapt their water use efficiency, nitrogen fixation, root development, photosynthesis. All of these physiological processes are, you know, daily processes that happen within the plant, and you know, we kind of take it for granted, but all of this is happening simultaneously. And a plant that is healthy is optimizing all of these physiological processes. A plant that's under stress is potentially not even doing some of these processes. They've shut them down. So, you know, when you consider a soybean plant that's under moisture stress, that plant is folding up its leaves during the daytime. It's not wasting energy on reproduction. It's not wasting energy on growth. It's literally in survival mode. And plants in that state are not actively flowering quite often. So all these changes in adaptation happen as these stresses are ongoing. And it's when these stresses occur in August in a soybean crop that causes that variability in yield year over year. So when we look at some of these and you know what you could do about them, some of them are quite manageable, and I think we sell ourselves short a little bit on how, you know, what some of these options are. So, you know, over the last 10 or 15 years even, we've complained about heavy residue and how much that's interfering with crop establishment. Well, you know, we've come to a point where we're doing more tillage, light tillage, creating a seed bed, nothing more, still leaving lots of residue on the surface. And it's allowing to establish a better population and a more consistent emergence timing. So there's so many of these stress factors that that occur every year. You know, someone is planting into cold soils somewhere. You know, that's when we're looking at using a seed treatment, protecting from root rots. Perhaps maybe planting into cold soils is not the right strategy. Really depends on what that future forecast looks like. We can manage fertility, soil sampling, you know, making applications of organic amendments or fertilizer, looking at meeting or exceeding those crop removal rates over time, and perhaps even building the fertility levels. Disease control, you know, if we're into those wet conditions in season. SCN, we've got plenty of tools to manage that. So all of these sorts of stresses really, you know, it comes back to how you set up that crop in the first place. You know, what you do in June and July really dictates your outcome in August. And that's where we want to focus our time is managing the setup of this crop and getting it off to a good start. So there's a lot of cases where we get in and we get scouting fields, and this is what we see. A hula hoop with not nearly enough plants in the middle of it. And you can see there's quite a heavy amount of residue in this scenario. And, you know, some of the beans haven't even emerged. You know, the seed is either sitting in dry residue or above the soil underneath the residue and not firmly planted into the actual soil. And, you know, this is something that we want to avoid. You get that staggered emergence when the rains do come. You get variable maturity in your stands, and, you know, the plant's wasting a lot of reserves and energy trying to get a root developed into the soil, and instead of actually getting up and getting growing and getting those trifoliates developing. So one of the other factors that you probably should consider as well in your soybean emergence and your seeding rates is the quality of your seed. And you know, we have seed metrics here in Canada and in Ontario that you know, for certified #1 seed quality that you know, that seed companies have to achieve. We also know that there's producers that are using farm safe seed for, you know, identity preserved or whatnot for their production systems as well. So having a good handle on that seed quality, and if it is less than perfect, perhaps it's not a seed lot that you plant in April or the first week of May. Save that until you have warmer, better soil conditions later on in the planting season. And pick your best seed lots for those early seeding windows where a seed could be sitting in the ground for a period of time. Looking at some of the seeding rate studies that have been done, and you know, I find these quite interesting because there's no two with the same outcome. Essentially, we're looking for trends in seeding rates and emergence rates when it comes to soybeans. So You know, here's an example. This was done by Ontario Soil and Crop and OMAFRA, and you can look, the counts have been done at 30 days after planting, and multiply by 1,000 to actually get your plant stand count. And so on the left, we have 7.5 and 15-inch rows at each of these treatments. So we have 150,000 seed drop, 175,000 seed drop, 200,000 and 225,000 seeds that have been dropped. And this one is only in 7.5-inch rows. And this is plant count. This is not actually yield in this particular chart. And you can see that, you know, dropping 150,000 seeds, we're ending up with 117,000 emerged. No difference between the two row widths. Dropping 175,000 seeds, we end up with 137,000 emerged. And up at 200,000, we're having 145 and 153,000 emerged. And you might look at that and say, wow, a quarter of my seed is not emerging. And that's, if you have not consistently been doing population counts in your soybeans, 25% loss at emergence is quite common. You know, if you're doing anything better than, you know, around 15% loss at emergence, that's a really strong emergence. That's a really strong seed lot that you have there, and seed bed and everything's worked out well. It's not uncommon to be dropping 200,000 seeds and only having 150,000 emerge. So, so you can see though from this data set that, you know, typically 15-inch row width, we get a little bit better emergence, a little bit stronger crop establishment numbers. And however, when you look at the big picture and you know, go back up to the 10,000 foot level, between 7.5 and 15-inch row widths, that's a very common question that I get all the time of which row width should I be in, which one's better. And there's lots of different reasons that you might choose one over the other, but I think you'll find that at the end of the day, you know, the yield is virtually equivalent. And some of the reasons to choose one way or another tend to be more logistical and operational, and, you know, optimizing equipment. It's not generally about yield. There is something to be said though about reducing some seed costs if you're in that 15-inch row width, because we're getting more consistent emergence, especially if those 15-inch rows are seeded with a planter unit. We tend to have less seed mortality, better emergence, and that's where we're getting into that, you know, 85% emergence scores in that scenario, which perhaps will allow you to save a little bit on your seeding rate and your seed costs. So just moving on and looking a little bit at the seeding dates. And, you know, when is too early to plant? And I think for a lot of folks in a lot of areas of Ontario, we threw planting date out the window. We just firmly packaged that right up and threw it out the window last spring. And, you know, with some early planting and some fantastic results from that. And certainly illustrated to a lot of us, myself included, how really tolerant these beans are to some less than ideal planting conditions. So a lot of beans were planted last May, right before the snowfall in early May, and still emerged and you know, still played out into 70+ bushel soybeans. So not a really big concern from early planting. And you know, I think we can basically interchange whether we're planting corn or soybeans on any given day in Ontario now. You know, assuming we have good seed lots and a good seed bed, and definitely want to be having some consideration for what the future forecast is looking like. You know, if it's one thing to be cold for a day or two, it's another thing to be planting into a very cold forecast for an extended period of time. But otherwise, I think it's quite reasonable to be planting in that first week of May. And you can see that, you know, when you look at the yields here by moving this up, into the earlier time frame, we're consistently gaining yields as well. So if this is not part of your strategy, if you're holding off to perhaps a certain calendar date that has historically worked for you, I would encourage you to try some early planting. Try and move that seeding date up a little bit and see how it shakes out for you. Some of the other considerations, though, that you want to have is to consider what variety you're going to grow if you're looking at planting early. And you're going to have more heat units. You're going to have an earlier harvest in the fall potentially. However, if a field is not intended to be planted into winter wheat in September or 1st of October, let's say, if that is not the intent, then you can easily add 150 heat unit variety into the mix when you're planting the first week of May and have it ready to mature, ready to combine by the 12th to the 15th of October. And that really changes up the dynamic of high yielding soybeans, in my opinion. It changes the timeline for harvest. It changes the timeline for pod fill. And by going to a full season variety, we tend to have a longer window of pod fill, and that gives us a better opportunity to hit those better weather conditions with lots of moisture. So certainly, hopefully, we're seeing a continued momentum towards these early planting soybeans. It ultimately doesn't cost more. It's one of those management tools that does not really cost any more unless you're having to hire someone to do it for you, of course, because you have other commitments. But essentially, we're just looking at seeding 10 or 15 days earlier than historically. So, and ultimately what we're trying to do is get to multiple branch soybeans, multiple trifoliates on our soybeans before flowering. And typically you're looking at flowering that first week of July, last few days of June, let's say. And the more nodes you have, automatically gives you more sites for flowering right out of the gate. And in a lot of years, we only have 3, maybe 4 trifoliate by the end of June, and versus 6 and 7 from the early planting. And that's, almost double the amount of flowering right there. So that's what we're trying to achieve. When you're doing early planting, I'm going with, at this point in time, until I see something otherwise, we're using the same seeding rate you would use 10 or 15 days later if it's the first week of May. And the reason I'm doing that is we might have somewhat higher seed mortality and somewhat lighter emergence. However, when you look at this plant on the screen right now, with the amount of branching that could happen on a plant like that, we more than make up for that slightly lower emergence number from the branching that we get out of these advanced plants when it comes into flowering. So the one thing I do typically lean towards, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of studies out there to validate it one way or another at this point, but I like to see a full seed treatment, both insecticide and fungicide on those early planted beans. The reality is they will sit in the ground for 2, 3, even 4 weeks, and the better those seeds can endure that period of time sitting in the soil, the better the emergence that we get out of them. And they're more vibrant when they do emerge. So something to look at and keep those seeds healthy while we're waiting for them to emerge. I also, one of the other factors when I'm looking at seeding early and having seeds potentially sitting in the ground for a period of time, do not use starter fertilizer, seed place fertilizer in that scenario. The longer, even just with MAP fertilizer, the longer that seed sits adjacent to that fertilizer, the poorer your emergence score will get as well. So definitely seen that firsthand, and I would recommend not to have seed place fertilizer in that scenario. So building a bigger factory, more nodes equals more flowers. And if we can go to a more full season bean for those acres that are not going into winter cereals, then that's another opportunity for potentially some higher soybean yields. This is seed corn maggot, and that is one of the challenges that comes with early planting and having seed. Well, it's not just early planting, it's any time we have soybean seed sitting in the soil unemerged or struggling to emerge, or even struggling to get growing when it is emerged. That's when we see these maggots in the, taking away our germ. They can feed right through the growing point. They can feed right through the stem, and thinner stands out quite dramatically. There's some areas of the province now that we actually almost always year after year have replants now because of seed corn maggot. So definitely one to consider if you have a lot of residue, a lot of organic matter, a lot of organic material from cover crops or even manure in your system, that puts you at a high risk for seed corn maggot. And sometimes the insecticides on the seed treatments are enough to help overcome this. But we're getting to a point here now where we're seeing fields, even with the insecticide treatments on them, that the maggots win. And unfortunately, they still, there's enough of them and so many of them at any one point in time that we're losing stand counts quite dramatically. So definitely want to be scouting if those fields are not emerging at that 3-week window and you've planted early. This is a big watch out that you want to keep track of. Just wondering, Luke or Carrie, do you guys, what do you guys see with some early planted soybeans?
Yeah, seed corn maggot is a big problem. It seems to consistently always be a big problem in that Tividale to Rossay to Drayton area. I don't know why. But generally speaking, that area for the last couple of years has at least one field that is replanted, and often ones planted quite earlier have a higher chance of that happening. I do really like your point on looking at that seed germ score, and if you're going to select varieties that plant early, make sure you got one that has a high good chance of getting out of the ground early and quickly. Yep. I shouldn't say early, but a good fighting chance to have a good vigor to get out, because it will take longer time to get out of the ground.
For sure.
Yeah, I would agree. Definitely the challenge with seed corn maggot, it seems across the board in our area, not just in a small section. But I also liked your tip about not having fertilizer down with the seed too, because of the length of time that it can sit there with that fertilizer, puts it at risk. That was a great tip. The other thing is more issues when it's too shallow, planted quite early. We had an example of April planted beans. I think we just did it for fun. It was April 4th or 5th last year, and too shallow, and the frost would have come down through the soil there too. But yeah, no, definitely seed corn maggot is probably the top issue though.
So how early are you planting your trial this year, Carrie?
Yeah, we talked about, that's hilarious that we were talking about even maybe trying it this week just for the heck of it, but nobody was ready. So
yeah.
83 bushels in Illinois.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. So no, we definitely are going to try it early April here once we get maybe equipment organized, but I will keep you updated.
Gray County, the new Illinois. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I covered all of that. One of the other maybe outcomes from early planting is with big, large branching canopies. You do want to watch for perhaps a higher risk of white mold. It's not always the case by any means. If your stand's a bit thinner and you have lots of branching on those plants, you're possibly still okay. However, if in fact that canopy is quite thick and lush, you definitely want to keep an eye on that white mold risk, and evaluate that as you're coming into flowering with those beans as well. Okay, I think we're gonna keep rolling here. Yeah, so moving into fertility and some strategies you might want to consider around fertilizer plants for soybeans. So there's quite a mixed message at this point in time around sulfur use in soybeans. And so some of the early studies have indicated, this picture here on screen is from Sean Castile from Purdue. And his was one of the first studies that I had heard, I think at the Certified Crop Advisor Conference, that he was seeing a response to sulfur fertilizer. And in that particular case, in that particular study, he really only found those positive responses on sandy soils. So that's great. Trying to figure out where and how we replicate these types of responses, because the response was big. It was, I'm trying to recall, but I think it was about 8 bushel. So anytime we can get something more than 2 bushel response in soybeans, it's worth taking a look at for sure. So, and in his study, he had 20 pounds of sulfur per acre. So not a super high rate at all. And just looking at some of the timings and products that he had used in his study. So, here's his untreated check, and this is mez. So this is a little bit different from the mez we use in Ontario. This one does not have zinc. It's just a MAP sulfur blend. And then ammonium sulfate, you can see achieving a very solid response there on ammonium sulfate. And he looked at different timings, early vegetative versus, early and mid and late reproductive stages as well. And then also split applying it as well, just as a comparison. And ultimately, it really, there was one clear winner in the whole trial, and that was just purely and simply having 20 pounds of sulfur from ammonium sulfate. Again, that sulfate form, that actively available form of sulfur that's readily available for uptake. It was the clear winner, and actually I shorted myself on what that yield response was, because that's judging from that, I was closer to 12 bushels. So now, how do we get this to repeat itself here in Ontario's conditions? Because anytime we can add 12 bushels to soybeans, I'm all for it. So this is a yield map from one of my clients, actually, and he's used some sulfur, and we're trying to figure out where and when and how. And he's a dairy farm. A lot of his, even his soybean ground tends to have, some manure applied to it over seasonally at the very least, if not the fall before the soybeans are planted. So in this particular example, right to the line where he applied, this was liquid ammonium thiosulfate, and this is a beautiful loam, perhaps edging towards a clay loam soil. Not great drainage in this particular field, but drainage wasn't a big factor here. For this was out of 2020, and that green strip, that green section, was a substantial response to the ammonium thiosulfate that he put on foliarly. With the that actually went on with the fungicide application at first flower. So, and I don't have the exact number here, but between the greens and the oranges here, we're looking at least 10 plus bushels. So it's one example, one year, but that's a pretty optimistic response. Keeps me excited about figuring out sulfur strategies in soybeans anyway. Yeah, and also along that vein is looking at how just in overall fertility strategies in soybeans. So in this particular study, they were looking more at the genetic development over time. And so they were comparing 1970 varieties with and without fertilizer, and then 1990 varieties with and without fertilizer, and then again in 2010. So they're basically running this every 20 years or so with and without fertilizer. And clearly in the 70s, I'm actually quite surprised that some of those yields are as high as they were with those early soybeans, but big response to additional fertilizer. And in the 90s, seems to have backed off with various genetics that were on the market in those days. And now we've seen, again, that big roughly 35% yield boost to having adequate fertility strategies in the ground ahead of soybeans. For the longest time, I've heard people say that, soybeans just scavenge what they need. Is there everything okay, Lori? Or
yeah, I just sorry to interrupt by me scaring you with my face. Tim had a question. What was the rate of ATS with foliar on soys, Deb? Any increased leaf burn noticed?
So we did that early, right at first flower. So like that R1, and it was put on with a fungicide, and I believe, I will have to double check just to be sure, but I believe that was 5 gallons. So not a big amount. That's roughly 15 pounds of sulfur. And I think if we're doing it that early in that sort of growth stage, there's not a lot of scorch from that. And we do use high water volumes when we're putting that on. So, you can picture that plant was maybe 10, 12 inches tall at that point in time. So that was that particular case. We'll keep exploring that. Certainly something to take into consideration though, because the scorch from ammonium thiosulfate on soybeans can be quite significant. So you want to have, if you are planning to use that strategy, you want to make sure that you're using, diluting it with water, or going early enough that you're not impacting a lot of leaf tissue. So this, we've looked at this, I think, this study from Dr. Hooker and Horst Bonner from OMAFRA over the, probably the last, I'm not sure when this was done, but I want to say maybe around 2010, 2012. But the key takeaway here is that, what we're finding is that there is definitely a response to additional fertilizer. So that's going down the chart from no starter to in furrow, MAP, 2x2 bands, things like that. And then we're also seeing a response just from basic soil fertility. So fields that have low fertility, fields that are high in phosphorus but low in potassium, the inverse, low in phosphorus and high in potassium. And then, and I wouldn't even consider these high, these are good solid levels, not excessive by any means. And you can see when we move into the where the fertility levels are solid mediums plus for all nutrients, in this case, phosphorus and potassium, even with no starter applied, just having that stronger base fertility, looking at 51 bushels versus 59 bushels. So here's certainly making a case for building fertility in your soil to get to that adequate level. where your yields are also more optimized, and your production is definitely higher at that point in time. So in the past, I have not been a big advocate of building soil fertility. Certainly from a corn perspective, we can duplicate some pretty big yields with starter placed nutrients and strip till and things like that. But when it comes to soybeans, this is a pretty consistent response where higher yields from higher base fertility. So even though they're doing a good job scavenging in lower fertility, they do a much better job and probably spend less time scavenging and more time producing when we have higher fertility. And you can see with the 624-6, so there's not big amounts of nutrients in a 624-6. It's convenient and it's easy to use, but we've still seen a 2 bushel gain over no starter at all. And even when you're using that in furrow on good fertility levels, you're probably not, basically what this is telling us is in good fertility levels, you're getting no additional yield from the 624-6. The good fertility levels carried themselves. And then, just a few other, looking at some other ways of looking at doing that fertility. In this particular case, it's a 2x2 band. Getting into a nice blended product of a 628-28 in a 2x2 band. So comparing it with no starter under low fertility situation, moving from 51 bushels to 56 bushels, and then going across the dial here from a low fertility environment to a high fertility environment. This actually was able to gain an additional 4 bushels. So there's something to this fertility strategy of getting it dialed in and improving that base fertility into, getting those P and K levels up into those more moderate ranges to have more consistent yields over time. And this is another set of trials that were done, again, by Horst Bonner in 2020. Where he had an untreated check, and then also he's working in this world of how do we get more out of these beans, and so exploring some nitrogen, exploring some sulfur plus nitrogen, and then exploring some of the newer versions of fertilizer that we have on the market today. So this is kind of interesting that 50 pounds of urea was making an additional 3.3 bushels of gain. This urea was applied early in the season. So basically, on those corn stalks in the first part of the season, and quite interestingly, still giving a measurable yield response. In this particular trial with ammonium sulfate, so at 100 pounds, you're getting 21 units of nitrogen. So pretty similar. 50 pounds of urea would be 23 pounds of nitrogen. And we got a very similar outcome. So in this particular study, we're making an assumption here, but I think it's safe to say that the response was coming from the nitrogen component of ammonium sulfate and not from the sulfur component there, being as we had the exact same results. And then looking at Aspire, which is potassium with a 1/2 pound of potash with a 1/2 pound of boron in it. Able to move that up just a little bit more to a 4.8 bushel response. I don't have the base levels of fertility from this site, but I'd say it was probably something that was maybe a little bit on the lower side of the spectrum for base fertility. And then treatment 5 here is kind of like the full meal deal. So this is 100 pounds of Aspire, Mez, K-Mag, and ammonium sulfate. And really, ultimately, a bit of a yield gain there, but not enough to pay for the load that is in that mix. And one of the strategies we use in cereals and also in corn is maximizing fertility, optimizing fertility, and coupling that with fungicides and getting a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of response. And soybeans just don't quite seem to work the same way. Yep, there's a little bit of a positive uptick there, but ultimately this mix would not be paying for itself at those types of yield responses. So interesting work, still trying to figure out where and when to use nitrogen, where and when to use sulfur, but definitely gleaning out some positive results here as well. So in addition to your typical broadcast for soybeans, you do want to be looking at your manganese and your boron levels as well, and the potential response there. At this point in time, most of these nutrients are in a broadcast format for Ontario soybeans, either broadcast in the fall or broadcast pre-plant. There's certainly some areas where starter placed phosphorus is being used. I have spent a lot of years trying to figure that one out, and I find our seed mortality increases to more like 40 and 50% when I use starter place low rates of MAP. So I've kind of backed that one down a little bit again and moved back to the broadcasting system myself. So definitely want to keep exploring this one. One of the other newer developments is that there's a lot of biologicals rolling out onto the marketplace, and just trying to understand where all of this fits in. New forms of biologicals that would replace our traditional rhizobia. So very leading edge, and a lot of on-farm trials happening in that world. So stay tuned to those developments. So just a quick, brief talk here on resistant weeds in Ontario, because it really plays into soybean weed control strategies. And, we can manage these weeds quite effectively in cereals and in corn. We have lots of options to draw from there, but our options in soybeans are slowly but surely getting whittled down, unfortunately. So on the left here, we have giant ragweed, and then we have Canada fleabane, and then common ragweed, and then also water hemp. And fortunately, common ragweed has really not taken off. There's a couple of examples in Ontario where we do have glyphosate resistant common ragweed, but fortunately, it's never really expanded from those original sites that it's developed on. The biggest one we're concerned about here in the short term now is water hemp. And I don't know about you, but when I look at these three pictures, it's awfully hard to tell one from the other. If I saw those sitting on the soil surface growing, I'd have an awful hard time picking out one from the other. So basically, the one thing to be looking for is that water hemp tends to have longer leaves, as opposed to these others that have more broader leaves, as because it's important to be able to identify it when it's very small. Once it gets some size to it, it gets a lot easier, but you've also completely missed any possible window of controlling that weed once it has any size to it. So this is the current spread of water hemp in Ontario. Actually, we added Wellington County in 2020 as well. So there's some at Clifford, and there's some at Fergus and Center Wellington, and I believe those are in this sort of green belt of they're resistant to 3 known chemistries. Unfortunately, with water hemp, we've got different groups that are resistant to different chemistries. Some are resistant to 2, group 2 and 4. Some are resistant to 2, which is group 2 and 9. Then we have 2 different 3-way combinations, and then a 4-way combination. And I believe in Quebec, we've added a 5-way combination that's also resistant to our group 27s. So this one's a real challenge, and it is right on our doorstep here in Grey and Bruce. And this you have to have a strategy that involves pre-emerge or early weed control that controls water hemp before it's emerging. And one of the other messages that I do want to add in here as well, though, is that when it comes to managing for resistant weeds, it's not just about herbicides. It's impressive to see how other management tools can really weigh in and help support a herbicide strategy. So, and essentially that's the fundamental basis of integrated weed management. So a diverse crop rotation, so 3 or more crops in the rotation. Like I said, these weeds are easily controlled in corn and in cereals. So if soybeans are your crop of choice 2 out of 3 years, you can understand how over a very short time frame you're going to be struggling with some of these resistant weeds. Having a diverse chemical rotation, again, much easier to do if that's coupled with a diverse crop rotation. So you can integrate all these other modes of actions and different chemistries that work differently. Increased crop competition. So that's looking at your seeding rates and your row width. We underestimate this one dramatically and where I see this one every year kind of jumps up and smacks me in the face is row width, particularly in edible beans. Is in those 30-inch rows, keeping weeds at bay for 8 weeks while those rows fill in is almost impossible. And if you're fighting some resistant weeds and limited chemical options, moving to narrow rows and getting shading quicker is a very key part of that strategy, so that you're not getting additional flushes or minimal additional flushes over time. We're seeing where cover crops play in at minimizing seed set. It is one of the factors of moving towards some tillage again. Tillage is actually a very good tool to support weed control with something like Canada fleabane. And of course, scouting and finding these populations before they're, overwhelming a field and a weed control strategy. So as I was prepping for this session, I was going through some of my old slide decks, and in 2016, I actually had this slide, and I thought it was kind of interesting that inconsistent responses to fungicides was my last note on this slide. But I think even just since 2016, we've learned a little bit about where fungicides fit in soybeans, and particularly in a year where soybeans are worth a lot of money. To get a 1 or 2 bushel response from a fungicide, to even have that covering your cost of application is quite real. So I think we look at putting a fungicide on soybeans and get a typical response of 2.5 to 3 bushels. In some cases, depending on where the data is coming from, we can even see more like 4 bushel yield responses. And at 4 bushel yield response, that's certainly paying for the strategy, paying for the product and the application. So some of the other factors you want to maybe consider when you're determining which fields you apply and which ones you don't is your actual variety and its tolerance to disease, particularly when it comes to white mold. Your stand density, if your fields are a bit on the thin side, fungicide might not be a factor for you. If your stands are quite thick and dense and well branched, a fungicide is probably a helpful tool in that dynamic. Rotation, beans on beans on beans. It's probably a situation where a fungicide will add some additional support in disease control. Your overall disease history. If you have had runaway breakouts of white mold historically in those fields, that definitely moves those fields to the top of the pile for potential benefit of having a fungicide applied to them. High fertility fields, fields that have had a lot of manure over time, and then giving some thought to your recent and future weather patterns. All of those factors play into whether or not you get a significant response to a fungicide in soybeans. I don't know that soybeans necessarily warrant every field all the time having an application of fungicide. However, when you look at perhaps $15 soybeans and the economics of where things are at, it's definitely puts it on the radar here for 2021, and definitely worth evaluating at where that sits in the program. And of course, above all else, a good rain in August to fill that profile. Makes or breaks our yields in Ontario. Quite, 2020, that was really the biggest value coming from 2020 versus 2019. We had tremendous rainfall through August, maybe even a little bit too much in the north part of the zone, but definitely above normal rainfalls that added to some incredible pod fill and test weight in these soybeans. So that's the winner right there. I did have a few slides here on, how to perhaps integrate some precision cropping into your strategies. Lori, was there any questions there on soybeans just in general before I wrap up?
I don't see any questions, Deb.
Okay. So with our precision cropping strategies, ultimately, this is the norm where we have our yield of let's say 200 bushel corn, let's call it, and sorry, our yields are over here in the blue line with our let me see here. Yep, with our current yields, and then this is our input level from corner to corner. We put on, following the orange line, the same input level, and yet we know in some zones we have lower yield and in other zones we have higher yield, and we're not really matching the investment to the productivity of the field. So we've known that for years, and in a lot of cases we just accept that. But the tools are on the market now where we can, more so than ever before, that we can manage this a little closer without without a big expenditure. So even if you're not someone that has all the bells and whistles in your own operation to be able to do this, most of our retailers and custom applicators do have those tools available. So it's becoming a situation where you could make the investment on some variable rate strategies that really don't involve a lot of equipment cost. It could be variable rate nitrogen, could be a seeding plan, it could be fungicides. We're using this quite often for fungicide applications. So lots of different ways to do this. Variable rate potash, variable rate lime, through your retailer could certainly implement the strategy for you. So it's not necessarily something that has to be done solely in-house with your own equipment anymore. We can move this data around a lot better than we ever could in the past. So yield monitor is nice. Definitely like whenever we can have yield information to help the strategy. We do have a lot more soil mapping options as well, between SWOT mapping and oh gosh, I just forgot the name of the other one. So, and ultimately what we're trying to do is figure out our soils spatially as we're going across the field. So you can look at an eroded hilltop, might have 2% organic matter, pretty typical. You might have some of those mid slopes that have 4% organic matter. That's a pretty good spot to be. And then we have in our depressions that have basically been on the receiving end of erosion for years and years, where our organic matter levels are more like 6%. And when you look at that from a nitrogen mineralization potential and the contribution that comes from those levels of organic matter consistently, not just nitrogen, even sulfur as well. You can imagine that there'd be far less contribution at 2% organic matter versus 6% in the hollows. So we want to work towards optimizing this information. And even for phosphorus and your pHs for that matter, you might have 3 parts per million in your soils on the knolls and 8 parts per million in your side slopes and 20 parts per million in those hollows. And to be able to treat that spatially as you're going across the field and optimize those inputs makes a lot of sense. Some of the other things we're doing with these zones is, we're scouting by those zones as well, looking at emergence rates. nutrient deficiencies, crop staging and development. I mentioned fungicides by zone, soil sampling by zone. That's an obvious one to determine those differences in organic matter and pH. We're even able to do tillage by zone now. I haven't had a chance to play with that one here yet, but the tools are on the market to deviate disc set on discs as you're going across the field based on a script as well. So here's an example of a farm with clearly some very interesting patterns to it, ranging from deep green to very light areas as it's, as you go across the field. There's all kinds of areas that are very mottled in color. And, going back to that previous slide, these would be your hollows, and these would be your ridges or your knolls. And this would ultimately be organic matter, very different organic matter. And in this case, this happens to be sulfur release based on those different zones in the soil. This was before we were using sulfur consistently. This field had already had its nitrogen applied. And then within a matter of days, we saw this sulfur deficiency come up in these patterns all over the field, which was very strongly linked to the gravelly knolls here. So you can imagine if you were going in using variable rate equipment, you could quite easily put on different rates in the hollows and and then higher rates potentially on those knolls. Here's an example of a SWOT map in another farm. So the reds tend to be sands and gravels and very porous soils, and the greens and yellows tend to be side slopes, and then the dark greens tend to be either muck or clay or something that's poorly drained. And on a farm like this, it happens to be 240-acre farm. If I was going in here to look for white mold, I know exactly where I'd be heading. I'd be heading into this dark green zone that is actually muck in this particular example. And if there's going to be white mold, it's almost always on muck soils. So it just gives us an option to be able to manage some of these finer points as we're looking to get a little bit more out of our production. So with that, I'll wrap up. And Lori, if there's any other questions.
Thanks so much, Deb. That was great. All three of you did a fantastic job. Tim says, lots of great production insights. Well done, Luke, Carrie, and Deb. Thanks for listening, letting me listen. Cool. Is there any final comments or questions before we wrap it up for today? No?
Just want to, I guess, thank you, Lori, for inviting us and putting it on. I know we'll probably get some people listening who weren't in person here, and that's great.
Wonderful. Yeah, I will, like I said earlier, I will create the link and that'll go out tomorrow for the paying customers. Not sure what went on today, but we'll gladly have them tomorrow or whenever they have a chance to listen to this. And we know there'll be tons of great information shared. And if they have any questions, once again, we will make sure that the questions get to one of these three facilitators and they'll have an opportunity to answer. So thank you. I can always count on you guys to do fantastic presentations. So thank you for all the time that you put into doing this today. Happy spring. Have a safe Plant 21. And I know that I'll see you in other meetings, etc. So enjoy that lovely weather out there when you can.
We will.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.